lecture series. My name is Maddie Pride, and it is my great honor and privilege to be here hosting you for our Literature Units 3 and 4 session. I'm so excited to be back taking part in this lecture series again. I'm super stoked to be here with you all. Thank you so much for joining us, choosing ATAR notes, and getting ready and set up for the second half of the year. We're so excited to be back with you. I hope you all had a really wonderful second term of school. I hope that the stress has died down a little bit and you're taking some time over the holidays to relax, recuperate, and prepare yourself for the second half of 2024. Today, I wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about ATAR Notes, particularly if this is your first time with us. So here at ATAR Notes, we're an education company that's passionate about making education easily accessible to you, no matter who you are, where you are, or what you need in order to feel empowered in your academic studies. So we have a huge range of free resources available for you, for whatever type of student you are, ranging from videos, newsletters, lectures, articles, study notes, even an ATAR calculator. All of these can be found over at our website, atarnotes.com. So please feel free after this lecture to head over there and check out all of our other resources and find the ones that are going to be working the best for you. But that's not all that we have. If you're looking to dig in a little bit deeper, then we also would love you to check out ATAR Notes Plus, which is our premium education service, which for a small subscription fee allows you access to literally thousands of high quality study resources, from full course notes for senior subjects to flashcards to practice papers, worksheets, text guides, and so much more. These are all resources that were created by recent high-scoring graduates. So these are people that know and remember what it feels like to be in your shoes. They have all of the insight, all of the experience, all of the wisdom to bring you the very best product. So if you're interested in making the most of what we have to offer, then please head over to ATAR Notes Plus and get started on a new chapter of your study journey. Now, Literature 3 and 4. I'm so excited to be here with you. Literature is definitely a passion subject for me. I love literature, so I'm so excited to be able to walk you guys through what you might be looking at over the next couple of months as you head into those final external exams at the end of the year. Now, I know that the majority of you will be Year 12 students who are prepping for that big exam at the end, but I know that there might also be some Year 11s who are here hoping to figure out the tips and tricks they might need to know for next year. Or if you're maybe figuring out if literature is something that you want to do in the future, you're a younger student, maybe grade 10, I wanted to say welcome to you as well. We're super excited that you're here. This is definitely a session that you can benefit from. Now, a few little housekeeping things. If you're watching this lecture live, then there will be a live Q&A session happening below this video. So make sure you make the most of that throughout our time today. There is seriously no such thing as a silly question, particularly in a subject like literature. So make the use of the moderator who is in that chat alongside your peers as well. Ask all kinds of questions, not just things related to literature, but broader study as well. The other thing is that these slides will be available to download in the resources section of this page as well. So if you would like to keep these slides as an ongoing study resource for yourself, please feel free to download them and stash them somewhere safe on your computer or a hard drive so you can come back and make use of them later on. Now, it's only fair if I'm the one that's going to be talking to you for the next 2 hours that I let you know a little bit about me, particularly if you haven't seen my face around before. So hello, hi, my name is Maddie, as I said earlier. I graduated from BGGS in 2020, which is now a whopping 4 years ago. It is entirely ridiculous, and I'm not too interested in talking about it. I'm currently studying communications and arts. That's a double degree at the University of Queensland. And within my arts degree, I'm majoring in international relations and peace and conflict studies. I'm hoping to work either in marketing or the public service in the future. I'm here to teach you how to read and write good stories, which has been the name of the game for me for the past 3 years. I've been working for ATAR Notes since I graduated high school at the end of 2020, and it has definitely become a passion project for me. I love working with high school students, I love working with senior students, and I love working with students who study literature. So if I haven't said it enough, I'll say it again. I am excited to be here and take you on this journey. That picture of me is from earlier last year and a raviolo I made in Milan. And the first thing that you can learn in our session today, in a session where you will hopefully learn many things, is that the singular word for that piece of pasta right there is a raviolo, and multiple pieces of pasta that look like that is ravioli. So one raviolo, many ravioli. All right, let's get into a bit of a breakdown and one more piece of expert advice before we go in. Get yourself a water bottle so you can stay hydrated. Today's session is a bit more of a marathon than a sprint. We're looking at about 2 hours of time. So get yourself a water bottle, make sure you're in a comfy spot, make sure that you have some snacks with you. Hopefully there will be some time in the middle of our session today for you guys to get up, have a bit of a move, have a bit of a stretch, but for now, definitely we'll need water on hand. No more than me, who is going to be yapping a fair bit today. So let's start off by having a look into the crystal ball about what today's session is going to look like and a bit of the breakdown. So we're going to start off with what lit isn't. We're going to be digging into a few myths and misconceptions around the subject of literature that you might have heard. Then we're going to go into some key skills to set you guys up for success. A phrase that you might hear me say a few times in our session today is working smarter, not harder. So I'm going to unpack that for you guys and the kind of skills that you might need to uphold that mentality throughout the rest of your year. Now, I know for some of you, for many of you even, IA1 and IA2, the analysis with your criticism and your creative spoken, are pieces that you've already completed earlier in the year and you're much more interested in the analytical exam. But every school is different, every teaching staff is different as well. So some of you might have already completed your creative written, others might have done their spoken and their written, and they haven't touched their analysis or with their criticism yet. So every school is going to be doing those assignments in a different order. So I want to touch on all of them at least briefly today so that people who are preparing for specific pieces of assessment still feel like they have the support and understanding that they need from this presentation. Now, because this video is pre-recorded, you are more than welcome to skip through those sections if you have already completed those pieces and don't feel like you need to get anything more out of them. But if you're in year 11 and you're preparing to go into literature next year, then I'm going to really encourage you to re-watch those sections, even if you recently completed those pieces of assessment, because you're going to be required to do them again in your senior year. We're going to hopefully have a bit of a particular focus on the analytical exam so that you guys will feel as if you're really nice and prepared for what you're working towards at the end of the year. But as I said, we'll go through each of these pieces of assessment to allow you guys a nice broad overview into what you need to be working towards for those particular pieces. Before we get started though, I wanted to say congratulations. You guys have made it through half of the year. It's pretty incredible that 2024 has already reached June. It feels like it was January 1st, 2 seconds ago. So congratulations, particularly if you are in your senior or graduating year of high school. It is such an incredible achievement what you have done to get here, all of the hard work that you have put in. You should be super, super proud of yourself. And I hope that you're going to have some time over this mid-year break to have a little bit of a rest and some time away from study, hopefully as well. I want you to be considering these few things though as we move into the second half of the year, hopefully to ensure that you're staying in that healthy, positive mindset. So it's really important to continue to consider and build upon the past mistakes that you have made in the first couple of months of the year. Even if you aren't completing those pieces again, if you have finished that last creative spoken and you never want to think about creative spoken again, it's still important to learn from the mistakes that you might have encountered while doing those pieces, because that feedback can still be put into use in different tasks. This isn't the time to speed up. A lot of students feel the stress and the pressure of their senior year of school and think that as they head into uh, July, August, September, that it really needs to be crunch time, and so they speed up and try to put a lot of work in. It might actually be more important to slow down, to be considering the skills and habits that you need to be cultivating and the way that you can be looking after your mental and physical health as you head into this stressful time of the year. Something that we want to avoid more than anything is academic burnout, which occurs unfortunately for so many senior students around September, October, because they have been working and grinding for so long. So, what I really want to encourage you guys to do is to figure out the different activities and skills and situations where you feel like you are energized and you are gaining back a little bit of rest, and the activities that help you recover well. When it comes to crunch time, it's really important to have those activities and those people and those situations that make you feel like you're gaining energy, because otherwise you will sink down and it's possible that your mental health will suffer. So definitely be considering those things. Keep building your skills by interacting with literature outside of what you are prescribed in school. This is so, so important. Many students come to me and they say, Maddie, how am I supposed to improve in literature, just on a daily basis? How am I supposed to get better at creativity? How am I supposed to get better at writing analytically? How am I supposed to get better at coming up with ideas? The best way to do that is to be engaging with all different forms of literature, with poetry, with short stories, with all different genres, with the written word, with the spoken word, with visual, physical art, with documentaries. All of those sorts of things are going to bolster and improve your literature-based skills, including minor things like your spelling and your grammar and sentence structure and things like that. I have with me a couple of book recommendations that I want to offer to get us started today before we get into content, because I say to students you should be reading if you can as an unwinding thing before you go to bed, so you're not on your phone. And then students say to me, okay, but Maddie, what should I read? I don't know what I want to read. So to hopefully combat that, I have some recommendations. The first one that I'm going to recommend is The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien. It is such a classic fantasy novel. So if you're into fantasy and you haven't read The Hobbit, you have to do it. If you have read The Hobbit, let me encourage you to reread it because it's really excellent. It is a book which is probably targeted towards a bit of a younger demographic, so you guys should fly through it. But I think that it's really excellent to read books like that sometimes because they're not very taxing on the brain. I think J.R.R. Tolkien is an absolute master in describing physical settings. So if you want to learn how to do that better, then give this one a read. Of course, this is a bit of a fancy copy. There is no need to be reading a fancy copy. You can get a banged up copy of it at the library that's been borrowed 3,000 times. But I definitely recommend to read The Hobbit. This is a book that I think everyone on planet Earth should read and should read from whenever they are able to, and that is To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. Now, many of you might have read it for school when you were younger. This, for me, is my copy from 2017 when I was in grade 9. It is just so incredibly excellent. It deals with some really heavy, tough topics in a way that makes them not palatable, but easier to understand and easier to engage with. And I think that the characters in this book are so wonderfully written. They are so rich. They grow and develop and change in ways that aren't cliche. It's just really excellent. So definitely read To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. If that's not really your style, maybe you're more into mythology or legend, or you're interested in a book that plays around with narrative structure, then let me recommend The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. So this book is a take and a twist on the Iliad, which is the classic Greek epic poem, in which a character called Odysseus does a few various things. Oh no, this must be it's called the Penelopiad, but it must be a variation on the Odyssey because that's about Odysseus. So this character Odysseus in the original Greek poem, he has a wife called Penelope, and she doesn't have much of a voice. We don't really get to know much of her story in the original, and her story is told in this little novella. It's only very short and really excellently done. Margaret Atwood is incredible. And speaking of Margaret Atwood, if you are more into sort of thriller, creepy, or you would like to try some short stories, then let me recommend Stone Mattress by Margaret Atwood. Short stories are really wonderful because they can be read typically in one sitting, and it allows you to get some literature into you when you don't have a lot of time or you don't have a lot of brain capacity to be trying to absorb a full novel. So Stone Mattress by Margaret Atwood, but truly anything that Margaret Atwood writes is incredible, so I will always be recommending her. And then finally, if you want a little bit of mystery, a little bit of intrigue, or you'd like to support some Australian authors, then The Dry by Jane Harper is really excellent. I actually read this book in one day. It just really got me. I ate it up super, super quickly. It's set in a small Australian town, I believe in Victoria, Kiwara. And it is, of course, a movie which now has a sequel. So there are two Dry movies now. So if you're not too keen on reading a full book, but you are trying to think of a movie, then I recommend The Dry. The book is definitely better, but the movie is also pretty decent. So that is my book talk segment for the start of our session today. All of these books are incredible. If you are keen to think outside your comfort zone and try something new literature-wise, then maybe you can start with some of these. All right, enough of that. Let's get into the actual meat and potatoes of today and talk first about what literature isn't. So literature isn't English. It's not English but harder. It's not English but different. It's not English. It's its own thing, and it's a lot about digging into books, movies, poems, short stories, novellas, plays with a new set of eyes. We're all about critical thinking in literature. We're all about problem solving. We're all about digging deep, deep, deep into the surface and unpicking all of the mess that occurs right at the heart of a story. Literature isn't just about reading books, and it isn't just about writing books. It's about the perspectives, representations, encounters that occur behind the stories. It's about the characters that represent broader thematic ideas and concerns. It's about all of the history and all of the social upheaval that goes into writing a story set in a certain period of time. So it's all about understanding the world. It's all about making sense of the world around us, making sense of history, making sense of important figures in history through the lens of stories. That is what literature really is about. So it's almost more a social studies subject than it is an English subject in one way or another. We're going to get into our key skills, and this is a section of today that I want to spend a little bit of time on because I think it's really important to be changing the mindset around study as a whole. A lot of students feel the pressure of the senior year, and for good reason. It's hyped up pretty much from the moment that you start high school when you're in grade 7, and it will continue right up until the very day that you graduate. And it can be really overwhelming and stressful and time consuming to be living amid that hype and that pressure for so long. We're going to talk about the skills that you can set up around yourself to hopefully alleviate some of that pressure, particularly in the most stressful times of the year, as you're leading up to exams, around assessment deadlines, and most importantly, at the exams that you might have at the end of the year. Those big, terrible external exams at the end. So we're going to hopefully set yourself up with some habits. So building some habits that you can rely on as discipline rather than motivation, and hopefully reduce some of that stress. Now, Before we go on, actually, I wanted to briefly talk about the difference between discipline and motivation. So, people talk a lot about what students should be using as they're heading into study. So, what is pushing them to study? Some people would argue that the answer to that is discipline. That's all around building habits. And if you have that muscle memory, if you have that habit, then you're just going to do it. That's the discipline part of it. Others say that motivation is more important, so that you should want to do it. You should have something that you're working towards, a particular success. You should be rewarding yourself for doing certain things, and that's what should be pushing you to do the work. I'm of the opinion that you should have both. Discipline is really helpful in the stressful times when you're feeling overwhelmed and you're not quite sure what to do or how to approach study. Those habits can be super helpful because they get you into the zone and they get you moving forward. But motivation is also really important because discipline has no regard for your mental health. Discipline says we just have to keep moving, we just have to keep moving. But motivation says that your emotions are going to change and shift and move. That's what it is to be alive. That's what it is to be a teenager. So I am going to encourage you to have a bit of both in your life. Be motivating yourself with positive reinforcement, be rewarding yourself for achieving tasks, but also aim to build discipline as well by setting yourself up with good, healthy study habits as well. The first key skill that I want to talk about is quote books, and that is massively important for your big external exam at the end of the year. So the very last thing you want to do is have to be scrambling around trying to find quotes at the last minute, particularly if you have to be memorizing them. So when you are introduced to the text that you're going to be exploring in an analytical exam, I encourage you to start a quote book straight away. And as you're reading through, as you're unpacking it in class, as you're doing your practice analysis, you're compiling evidence in that quote book as you go. So the more detail that you can put in your entries, the better, because it's less work that you have to be doing in crunch time in the last week or so before the exam. So you might include details such as who said the particular quote, who they said it to, what particular aesthetic features or stylistic devices was used in that quote, the way that it was said, the context in which it was said, what's happening in the novella or the play or the text at the time. So think about putting some detail into the quote books, and then as you're prepping to head into the exam, you can go through that quote book, find the best ones, find the quotes that link to the most themes, or quotes that are the most versatile for analysis, or quotes that you think are going to be really beneficial for certain questions, all of those sorts of things. So it's just about building yourself a really robust resource that's going to take a lot of pressure off your shoulders. The next is study notes, and it's pretty obvious that I would say something like that, but I think you'd be surprised at how much a difference it makes to have a full set of notes compiled in one place together, particularly when they are organized. That truly is the difference between an alright thing and a really excellent resource. So these notes don't have to be overly complicated. They don't have to be overly professional. They just all have to be in one place, and they should be keeping track of the information that you are studying in class. What I'm going to really encourage you to do is to be keeping really brief notes, even if they're just in dot point form during class. Some of the best conversations that are really helpful to understanding texts happen when you're in class and you're just bouncing ideas off of each other. So being able to take notes during conversations like that can really change the game. And this is particularly true because everyone in your class is going to be bringing different perspectives, ideas, and representations to the conversation that you're having about a text. The person sitting next to you could have a completely different understanding of a character or theme than you do, and that's a good thing because it allows you a deeper understanding of the text. And even if you don't agree with what they have to say, it can still be useful to you because perhaps you use that take to then bolster your own by figuring out how you might shut that down in an analytical capacity. So definitely be mindful of what's going on in class, and the more notes you can take in that setting, the better. I would encourage you to be taking these notes digitally on your computer because you can just typically do that so much faster than writing it down by hand. But if you really enjoy writing by hand and you think it allows you to absorb the information a little bit better, then there's nothing wrong with doing that as well. Your notes should also include perspectives on things. It's really important that you have an opinion on kind of everything that you're interacting with within a text. This might be themes, characters, relationships, and I definitely encourage you in your notes to also be practicing your analysis. Your writing muscles are just like any other muscles in that they need to be trained in order to get bigger and stronger. So if you know that you struggle with analysis, then the sooner you can start practicing it, the better. Even if it's just in quote form. So you take a quote and you unpack and analyze that. The more you do that, the easier your life will be. The next thing that I want to say want to suggest is annotations. I like to argue that a well annotated text is truly the biggest and best gift that you can give your future self. They allow you to find important information within a text really, really quickly and ensure that you have actually understood what you are reading because you're unpacking it in detail. They allow you to get a head start on your analysis as well because all the information or questions or perspectives that you might have on a piece of evidence are right there on the page in front of you. Now, again, your annotations are going to look different depending on who you are and what you like to get out of those annotations. So for some students, the margins of their pages are absolutely full with tiny little words where they've unpacked quotes, spaced it out. They might have a whole rainbow worth of sticky tabs around it where they've really unpacked a novel in depth. But for others, it might be a few little symbols throughout the margins. Maybe a little star that says, this is where the theme of grief has arisen again. Maybe it's a little arrow which says, this connects back to a paragraph on page 37, something like that. Whatever you think is going to be useful and helpful for your future self when you're under the pump, that's what you kind of want to be prioritizing and focusing on in your annotations. You can base your annotations, if you're not quite sure where to start, on some of the most common question structures. So in an analytical exam, typically your question or your prompt will be based on one of these 5 categories. The author's intent, so what the author wants the audience to think, feel, or react by the end of the text, the key themes in the text, key or famous quotes in the text, aesthetic features or stylistic devices, and or characters and relationships. So if you're not quite sure what you need to be looking out for when you're doing your annotations, these are great places to start. So identify your key characters and the key relationships that those characters have. Every time those characters develop and change for better or for worse, then maybe you can make a little note of that. If a relationship changes from friendship to a romantic, then that's clearly quite an important part of the text. So what does that say about it as well? And so on. The more that you do it, the easier it will become, and it becomes a little bit more intuitive. So I encourage you to have a go. Now, depending on what the kind of text is that you are reading, annotations might look a little bit different. So if you're reading a play, you might annotate a scene at a time. If you're doing a novel, perhaps a chapter. Some novels have really long chapters though, so you might read through a few pages and go back and annotate. It's just depending on how much time you have and how much effort you kind of want to put it into your annotations as well. The next skill that we are going to cultivate for our future self is practice writing. As I mentioned before, writing, it's a muscle. It only gets stronger when you use it. And this is particularly true and particularly important because the standard for writing in literature really does feel quite high. You're expected twice a year in your analytical tasks to write concise, intelligent, well-constructed, well-supported essays in exam conditions in just over 2 hours. It's a big ask. So the skills that you can cultivate in writing before you have to sit in that exam room are going to be really, really important. So, how do we practice writing well? The first thing to say is that you need to set the space. So you need to be in an exam similar space to try and replicate those conditions as much as possible. So that might be ridding your space of all distractions, technological and otherwise. Being mindful of your timing as well. So having a timer there, which will allow you to identify how much time you have left in that session. It's really important to try and practice the whole essay from start to finish in a similar way that you'll do in the exam room. And I want you as well to be writing as though you are in the exam. So you're not using contractions, you're not using casual language, you're not saying, you know what I mean, ... We don't know what you mean. You have to tell us. So make sure you are writing as if this was going to be given into QCE at the end of the year and they are going to be marking it. And then it is so important. The writing is only half the job. You also have to edit. So go back through in the same way you would in an exam room, proofread carefully. Identify your weaknesses that you might have done. If you need to, I'm going to encourage you also to get feedback. So you can take it to your teacher and say, I wrote this in exam conditions. Can you give me a little bit of feedback about how I can improve? The other people that you can go to are your peers. They're all in the same boat as you. I'm sure many of them will be keen to also be practicing in a similar capacity. So say to them, I would love if you could read my work. I'm happy to read some of yours as well, and give them feedback about how they can improve, both what they might need to work on a little bit more, but also what they have done really well, because you need to have a bit of that balance of the positive and the constructive criticism as well. All right, as I claimed earlier with our reading, one of the surefire ways to improve vocab, critical thinking, and boost your creativity is just engaging with as much external literature to school as possible. This is something I didn't mention earlier, but it's really important to note. It should be really fun. So choose texts that excite you and interest you. I know for many of you at the start of each term, you'll be given your books that you're reading for school and you'll go, I don't want to read this. This does not interest me in the slightest. This is not going to be engaging to me. So when you're reading outside of school, pick things that you want to read and don't overthink it. It really shouldn't be a chore. That being said, I do want to encourage you to be a little bit brave and maybe read outside of the typical genres or styles that you enjoy as well. All right, let's get stuck into our first topic, and that is our analytical essay. So this is a screenshot from the QCEE website. It's going to be a really important resource that you guys should use if you haven't already. All of the syllabi for all 4 pieces of assessment are available for free on the QCEE website, including a whole range of practice exams and past papers for the external literature exam as well. So make use of that. Go and check that out if you haven't already. And it's really important to have a look because it gives you an understanding, a bit more of an idea about what the standards and expectations of the QCEE are when it comes to a senior literature assessment task. So, IA1, which is your analytical exam with a criticism as well. So students write an analytical essay in response to a seen question or task under supervised conditions for an audience with a deep understanding of the studied text. The question or task must relate to how a particular literary text, selected from a prescribed text list, addresses issues and ideas related to culture and identity, and must allow students to critique others' interpretations or responses to the literary text. And then it goes on to talk about what the questions might include or might focus on. So the real kicker, the real important part of this question is here. It must allow students to critique others' interpretations. So you're not just talking about the author's choices, you're also talking about another person's interpretation of the author's choices as well. So, how do you do well in your IA1? It's very rarely a student's ideas that ever trip them up in an analytical task. You talk about these texts so much in class, you have such a deep understanding of the characters and the themes and the ideas that that's not really ever the issue when it comes to doing this exam. It's more regularly the synthesis. So how those ideas are strung up together, how the essay flows, how you're connecting your ideas, are you linking back, all of those sorts of things. My number one piece of advice for this task and for any task like it, both in high school and beyond in uni, if that's what you choose to do, is to identify the weaknesses you might have in linking. It's really important that your argument is coherent so that people understand what it actually is that you're trying to say and whether or not they feel like they want to get on board with your argument or they want to refute it. So it's really important, what might those weaknesses look like? So it could be you're not contextualizing your evidence clearly enough. Perhaps you're not linking between your paragraphs, or perhaps, and quite tragically, you're not linking back to your thesis. So identify what it is that, in terms of synthesis, that you're not doing well, and address that first. Logic flow is really, really vital. This is particularly true in the workplace. If you're trying to argue for something, for anything in the workplace, and your argument isn't quite coherent, then you're going to be let down a fair bit. So it's worth paying a little bit more attention to this skill. The number one rule for reading academic criticism. So, academic criticism is the other perspective that you're going to be critiquing in this piece. Now, it can be pretty overwhelming to dig into this kind of criticism because often a lot of teachers will present you with criticism that's written at a tertiary level. So, not even really for undergrads, but postgrads and beyond. So, the number one rule is to take your time. Slow and steady really wins the race. One of the worst mistakes you can make is rushing in, make an assumption about what they're talking about, and then writing it as if it's true when it's actually not. They're not BuzzFeed articles. They're not meant to be read in 5 minutes. Even if you want it to be so, even if you would love if you could read it in 5 minutes, that's not really the way that they are structured. So my recommendation, if you have the luxury of a fair bit of time, is to read it all the way through once and kind of get a broad overview or broad idea about what it might be talking about. As you go through, highlight any words or phrases that you don't understand and go to people with help unpacking and unpicking these. So Google can definitely be of help, but your teacher and your peers are going to be your key resources for this one. Once you have a decent understanding of the criticism as a whole, it's really important to identify what the author's what the critic's thesis is. So this is the most important part of your essays. The thesis is the most important part of your essays. This should also be true for the critics as well. If you can't find it easily, it might not be in the intro in the same sort of clear, straightforward way that yours is. It's probably going to be repeated in various forms throughout the piece. So what's the argument, idea, or theme that's repeated most throughout the criticism? That's generally the argument or thesis of the critic. So identify that first. And it's also important, once you've identified that thesis, to decide whether or not you agree with it. Do you think that they have an accurate understanding on what the author has done, what the author has chosen, or does it differ from your understanding of the novel or text? And do you have your own understanding of it? Mark their arguments throughout, so mark the different points and pieces of evidence that they use, and each time decide whether or not you agree. At all of these points, you can decide, is there another piece of evidence in the text that you think could be stronger for this, or do you think there's a piece of evidence in the text that refutes that claim? Whether or not you agree with it, their logic can be used to your advantage, in the same way that the perspective of your friend sitting next to you in class can be used to your advantage, even if you don't specifically agree with it. If you annotate more, if you decide that you want to annotate more beyond those things that I've just outlined, also a good idea to keep track of the key themes from the text that being discussed in the criticism. That gives you a pretty good idea about what the critic thinks is important in terms of thematic value in the text. So if they talk loads about grief, then it's probably a good idea that grief is a really central theme for the text. This seems like pretty basic stuff, but it's really good to just get a deeper understanding of a text based on the other work that people have done. Let them do the hard legwork for you, and you can really benefit off their understanding and off the work that they have done. Now, does the critic take a stance with or against the author? That's another really important question. So typically in any piece of writing, the author of the original piece will have some sort of message or moral that they want the audience to think, feel, or understand by the end. Now, the critic may or may not agree with that perspective or representation that the original author has offered. A lot of the time, the kind of texts that you guys will be reading in literature were written a fair while in the past, and they typically have a bit of a political or social take that they want to be offering to the broader population. So figure out whether or not the critic agrees with the original author, and then does that critic's opinion on that particular matter align or disalign with your own? Now, This is going to be really important. It's something that I'm going to be driving home definitely at the end of our presentation when we talk about EA1. But this is going to be writing a good thesis. So the thesis is the golden thread woven throughout the whole tapestry of an essay. It's the most important thing. It's the cornerstone of the building. Without it, everything else falls apart. You can have excellent analysis. You can have top level evidence. You can have beautiful audience positioning and a really excellent introductory paragraph. But if you don't have a good thesis, then your marks are going to suffer. So, the thesis in this particular task, where you're including this idea of the critic, it's built upon the opinions of your own and the critics as well. So, for example, a question might look like this. Critic X proffers that Conrad's language choices in Heart of Darkness challenge the veneer elite, that's not a Dutch word I just can't spell, like quality of imperialist civilization. To what extent is this interpretation correct? Take a moment. Based on what we've talked about, how might you go ahead and answer that question? What might you be focusing on? All right. First things first, you need to consider the to what extent part. So if any question or prompt has a to what extent section or phrase in it, that means that you need to have some sort of measurement word which indicates where you stand. So you might say that critic X is partially correct or critic X is wholly correct. And then extra detail turns it from a hot take, into a discerning thesis. So you might say that critic X is wholly incorrect, that Conrad manipulates language choices to strip away the veneer of imperialism and expose those who employ it. So remember that our focus here is on the critic and what the critic thinks of Conrad's choices. It's not what we think of Conrad's choices necessarily, but what critic X thinks and whether or not their take is correct or incorrect. That's based on our opinion. All right. So it's really important to not forget the audience and the syllabus by the QCEE, and I'm sure in all of your own internal syllabi as well, they will not rest in reminding you that audience positioning is such a vital part of the task. And this really breaks my heart because so many students forget to include it. It's really, really important that you're considering the broader audience of a text when you're doing your analysis and considering how what you uncover in your analysis is going to be affecting and shaping the opinions of the audience themselves. Now, what an audience thinks about a particular idea or theme in a text is based on 4 things: cultural assumptions, attitudes, values, and beliefs. And these are defined here from another screenshot from the QCEE syllabus. You need to consider how the history and the culture that surrounds a particular audience is going to sway their reactions to a text, rather than enforcing your own responses upon them. So if you're disgusted by something, you might think, oh, the traditional audience would absolutely also be disgusted by it. But that might not necessarily be the case. In Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, there is quite a few misogynistic undertones in the text. But the traditional audience at the time would not have thought about feminism in the same way that we think about it today. So they probably wouldn't have been as disgusted or disgruntled as we are when we read a book like Jane Eyre. So it's not correct to say that they would have been horrified by it, because that might not necessarily be true. So definitely be considering and keeping that in mind. The other thing that you're going to be looking for in your analytical tasks is what I like to call the microflow. And this is how to be structuring your body paragraphs to ensure that you're including all of the necessary detail in your analysis. So it's a bit of a formula, and you can kind of plug in all of your own thoughts and ideas to ensure that you're ticking all of the boxes. So it's a series of 4 questions in a row, and it goes like this: what? So what? So how? So now. And I feel a little bit like I'm on Play School when I do that. So your what is your evidence? And your evidence has to be contextualized, of course. So you're not just plugging in a act number or a scene number. You're not just plugging in a page number. You're contextualizing the evidence in the broader context of what's happening in the text when that thing is said. So, for example, following Hamlet's father's death, the prince declares, or after seeing his father's ghost on the battlements, Hamlet declares such and such and such. Include evidence after that. It allows whoever is marking your work to sort of orient themselves. Okay, where are we in the text when this is happening? What has occurred? It's really important that we know what's happening because it just gives us the necessary context to understand the evidence well. Then once we have included our evidence, we ask ourselves, so what? So what does this mean? Or so why do we care? And that's your analysis, unpacking, you're pulling out specific structural features or aesthetic devices that might have been used by the author to create certain reactions or responses. Speaking of reactions or responses, the next step is so how? How does this position specific cultural or historical audiences to think, feel, or react? Now, depending on what the task is, you might be asked to consider traditional or original audiences and contemporary or modern audiences as well. If that's the case, I'm going to encourage you to include discussions on contemporary and traditional audiences at least once throughout your essays. They don't have to mention both types of audience in every paragraph that you do. And then the final step of the microflow is so now. So now let's link this back to my thesis. So linking back to your thesis is a massive part of improving your logic flow. It allows the marker to see that you are building on and extrapolating your argument with each paragraph. You're not going off track, you're not talking about something else. You're sticking to a particular argument and what it and how it links to the broader ideas in your text as well. All right, that's IA1. Let's move our necks around, have a little bit of a stretch before we head into our second section for today, our IA2. We're doing well. Make sure you're making the most of that live Q&A chat down below. Have another sip of water. All right, IA2. So your first of your 2 creative pieces for literature in senior year. So another screenshot from the QCEE. It says students produce an imaginative spoken or multimodal response to at least one literary text from the prescribed text list, which is thereby referred to as the base text. In this assessment, they draw on their knowledge of the relationship between language, culture, and identity to reinterpret ideas and perspectives in the base text to create a reimagined text for a new cultural context. So the key words are really in that last couple of phrases: reinterpreting ideas and perspectives, a reimagined text for a new cultural context. That's the name of the game for this particular task. So, how do we reshape meaning? This task is all about taking something familiar, something relatable, something that we know and understand, and reshaping it, changing it, refocusing it so that the meaning is changed and the audience is offered something new. So, consider the image of 2 women meeting on a bench at a park after a falling out. They used to be friends, they're not friends anymore, something wrong has happened. They are unable to rectify their difference, so they do not speak, even with years of history. How might you reshape this image? How might you tell this story differently? Take a minute or two. Have a think. What might it look like for these 2 ladies to be telling this story differently? You're feeling brave? Maybe put it in the live Q&A chat. And if you're watching this session back later and you've already done this task, how might you do it a third time? What might it look like again? How might you change it again? All right. Consider this. Perhaps the setting is not a park, but a party, and one late at night. The women are not grown anymore, they're just girls. Perhaps the disagreement is about a boy. Perhaps the metaphor used is not silence as it is in the original story, but the ceaseless noise of war. What about a divorce, but told from the perspective of the oldest child and not the parents? Consider a murder, told from the perspective of the lawyer. Consider these stories told to therapists and taxi drivers and the weekly book club. So, one of the biggest and best ways that you can reimagine stories is by giving the microphone to someone who didn't have a voice originally. This is the whole premise of the Penelope ad. So, Odysseus, he has all the power and the agency in the original story. Penelope has none. What Margaret Atwood does to reshape meaning and to really talk about feminism and female agency is to give the microphone to Penelope and let her tell the story and let her give her own perspective and her own understanding of the events of the Odyssey. So, this is really your role and your task in this story, and it's such an interesting one. I'm going to really encourage you to be tackling and digging into topics that you care about, topics that are close to you, topics that you think you have a take on, ones that excite you, and certainly topics that you would want to read about yourself. There is nothing wrong with wanting to write about something that you would enjoy reading. This is how you produce work that you are proud of, and this is how you produce work where your own distinctive authorial voice is clear. So, the key perspective that you decide to explore should be one that excites you. All right, so how do you change cultural context like they talk about in the original syllabus? So it's all about changing your destination, where it is that you want to land. The syllabus calls for a new cultural context, and this is achieved via a shift in time and or place. So, for example, you might be time traveling, playing around with history and different norms throughout history. One of the easiest ways to do this is to take a book that was written for a period in the past and then bring it into modern day, bring it into the future. How do cultural ideas and perspectives change? What does it look like today in a way that it didn't look like in the past? You could also talk about teleporting, so playing around with geography, culture, and values. So, if a story is set originally in England, what might it look like in America, or Australia, or India, or Antarctica? What might it look like in those different parts of the world? And how do those specific cultures deal with or interact with those stories and ideas in a way that we might not hear in Australia? So, again, leverage your own cultural background, your own understanding, stories from your family, stories from your grandparents and their parents, and so on. All of that really unique, specific voice that only you can bring to a task, that is going to really change the game when it comes to writing a good, engaging story that audiences feel like they can connect with. So, how do we tackle the creative elements, the visual elements of this story? Because it's a multimodal task primarily, the opportunities and possibilities really are endless. So often the easy part is coming up with that key message and how to transform it. And then you're left to sort of fill in all the gaps with what some might call the creative stuff. So this could be a monologue, a YouTube vlog, a video, a podcast, a dramatic performance, and so on and on and on. And I really want to encourage you guys to think a little bit outside of the box and to be a little bit brave with it as well. This is year 12. You have the opportunity to be doing something pretty unique and pretty exciting. So again, be considering what you would be interested to watch and what particular parts of media you have really enjoyed in the past. If you love to sort of set up a creative, not a creative, a YouTube sort of slice of life based content, then maybe that's something that you want to replicate. If you quite like a sort of documentary thriller sort of situation, then maybe you want to try and replicate that in one way or another. If you just really enjoy a good sit on the couch and a conversation with a close and cherished friend, then maybe that's what you want to replicate in your own monologue as well. So consider what you enjoy, what you know works, the particular elements of those formats that work well, and take that. You're allowed to take inspiration from people. In fact, you're encouraged to. It would be silly not to. So have a look at the world around you, consider how they have told stories well, and utilize that in your own work as well. All right. If you're doing this performance live, then there is also a few tips and tricks that are important to know. It's a really, really good idea to know your character inside out because audiences can smell a fraud a mile away. If you have tossed together a story at the last minute, they will be able to tell, I promise you that. So remember that you're really trying to be thinking outside of the box, particularly when it comes to narrative structure, the genre, and style. So experiment with tone, perhaps even props and costuming as well if you're feeling particularly brave. The more that you commit to it, the more that people are going to get on board. The other thing that you need to know inside out is your script. The key to good public speaking is appearing as if you are entirely 100% head to toe confident, even if you really are not. So find a safe person in the audience, practice in the mirror, and have a solid recording of your performance to evaluate when you are still practicing. That is going to really change the game when you're up there in the spotlights, feeling the pressure. All right, in your multimodal pieces, if you are filming them beforehand, then scripts are going to be important there as well. But you have a bit more wiggle room because you have the opportunity to be making mistakes and stuffing up and being able to call cut and things being changed in post and all of those sorts of things. Like any other literature-based task, your message, your purpose, the moral of your story, what you want audiences to know or feel, needs to be really clear and apparent in your writing. And then you need to lift this message up to the audience with the help of the visual and audio-based aids, like aesthetic features would in a novel. So your visual and auditory choices are important and can hold specific and impactful messages in them. So for example, you might choose to include Australian native flora in your visual piece to represent a sense of place and connection to the land. All right, a few broad tips about this piece because I have seen students struggle with this. Ooh, it gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. This is not the task to do the night before. No task ever really is, but this one in particular, I promise you, you will so seriously regret it if you try and do this the night before. Editing always takes far longer than you think it will. It's such a finicky process, so definitely be considering your timeline about how you're going to space this out to make your life as easy as possible. Adapt to the flow. Your piece is going to change considerably throughout this process. You're going to have new ideas. The particular visual vision that you might have had for this piece might not be entirely executable in practice, so things might have to change there. If you're working with video, back it up twice, 3 times, 4 times, many times. You want it to be in various forms, in various places, so you don't lose it. I really encourage you to work with a downloaded editing software rather than anything that you work with online, just because things can crash and things can go wrong, and I just get the heebie-jeebies thinking about it. You can find royalty-free music and video online really, really easily. There's actually a huge repertoire of free content out there for you to use. So go ahead and make the most of that. Of course, YouTube download MP4 to MP3, classic, been there. But there is so many kind of quite high quality resources for video editing online. So definitely be using those. And really importantly, make sure you watch your video all the way through before you submit it. Sometimes people have weird crackling audio in the back of their voices, even after in the back of their videos, even after they've been exported. Sometimes a rogue subtitle pops up where it's not supposed to be. Sometimes a clip is left longer than it's supposed to be, all of those sorts of things. So make sure that you watch the full piece start to finish before you submit it. And then that is going to be your final piece. All right, we are doing well, people. We're about halfway through, but it's time now for our mandatory 10-minute break. And this is all going to be about what you guys are doing down in the live Q&A session below. So get down there, start asking some of your key questions if you haven't already. Remember, you are more than welcome to ask for advice on anything that you feel like you need to know, both literature, broader study ideas, year 12, all of those sorts of things. Make use of the expert moderator that's there, but also your peers. There is so much experience and wisdom to be used down below. So let's take 10, have a stretch, move around, move your body, and then we will get stuck into IA3 and our big external to wrap up our time together today. Okay, about a minute left. Have your last little sip of water, do your last little stretch, ask your last question down below. The chat will still be going for our second half of our session, but make the most of the time that you have now. There is that magical timer. A little bit disturbing to hear that noise in the middle of the day. All right, let's get stuck into the second half of our session. We're going to be starting this one off with IA3, which is our second creative task for the year. Now, it's likely that these next two sections are going to be a little bit more applicable to many of you because this is what is coming up in the next couple of months. So definitely, if you have any particular questions about these, be sure to continue to be asking them down below. So this is a screenshot from the QCEE, and they talk about this topic as so. Students independently develop and compose an original, imaginative written text in which they purposefully manipulate aesthetic features and stylistic devices to shape representations and perspectives and achieve particular effects. Students may respond in any imaginative form that is predominantly prose and allows them to demonstrate the assessment objectives. So, really important keywords in this paragraph: manipulating purposefully, perspectives and representations, imaginative form, predominantly prose. So something that is talked about a lot in your syllabus, particularly in your senior years, is this idea of purposefully manipulating or purposefully writing or purposefully reimagining. Everything has to have a reason or a drive behind why it is that you are doing it. You're making choices intentionally. You're not just doing them for the sake of doing them or because you think you need to have them in there. It's all about those choices working towards a wider or bigger goal. All right, so how do you go about planning a creative piece? I am a big proponent of a good plan. I think it completely revolutionizes the writing process because it just gives you so much power when it comes to writing. You don't feel like you're sort of squabbling, squandering around trying to find what you want to write about next. You have everything there in the plan and you can kind of just go from there. When you start writing creative, it's difficult to know where to begin. So I always encourage students to start with their purpose. What do they want audiences to know or understand by the time they've finished reading the piece? You have the honor as the author. You get to decide what the purpose is. Are you going to celebrate something, criticize something? Are you going to entertain for certain purposes? Do you want to inspire, etc.? Again, be brave, be bold, be creative about what you want to talk about, and definitely be picking things that excite you, that will serve you well, all of those sorts of things. What particular cultural assumptions, attitudes, values are you going to be drawing on to position your readers? That's the second question that you need to be asking yourself. So what particular cultural context do you want to be exploring? What sort of broad themes or ideas do you think would be interesting or engaging to talk about? Pick a genre and style that suits your purpose and also gets you excited. So remember that this is the only sort of boundaries you have in this task is that it has to be predominantly prose, but you could be writing a screenplay, you could be writing poetry, you could be writing a short story, you could be writing a monologue. There are so many things that you could be talking about or doing in this particular task. So really, if you've been itching, you're like, okay, I'd actually really love to try and write a screenplay, then this is your opportunity to do that. Now, planning a short creative is really important. So in literature, typically this task is going to be around 1500 to 2000 words, and that's really not a lot in the grand scheme of things. Now we're lucky because typically the creative task in English is around 800 to 1000, which is a ridiculously short story, so you have a little bit more wiggle room in this particular task, but it's still important to be thinking about writing in the shorter context. So a few things to be keeping in mind. Number one, your first draft is just a skeleton. It's not going to be incredible. In fact, it's probably not actually going to be much good. The role of the first draft is about getting ideas down on the page, and then you can take it from there and refine and build and explore and all of those sorts of things. So a lot of students come to me, they're really worried, they think that they're not very good writers, that they're not very creative, that it just doesn't look very good at all. They bring me their first drafts, and that's okay. Your first draft is literally just a proof of concept that this will work in a story-based context or in the style or genre that you're exploring, and then from there you just get better. The more time you can give yourself for this task, the better, because it allows you all the time that you need to develop the story, to grow it, to make it better. The second point here is to make it your own. I've mentioned this quite a few times in our session today, and that's a pretty good indicator that it's important. Talk about and discuss and explore topics that interest and excite you. Now, you probably don't want to be going to the news, because not a lot in the news is very engaging, or well, it is quite engaging, but it's not very happy at the moment. But if you want to explore those ideas, then by all means, talk about issues that are important to you. Talk about stories that are relevant in your family, that might be related to people that you love or care about, your friends and family. Get used to the tiny house. You don't have a lot of room, so it's going to be important to practicing writing short stories. In your plan, don't be including, if you do include loads and loads and loads and loads and loads of detail in your plan about what you're going to be writing, remember that you're not going to be able to probably include all of that detail in a fleshed out way in your story. It is more important that there is a clear rise in tension, there is a conflict, climax, and resolution, than it is that you get all of those little details in there. Really important to keep it in the family, which really just means only be using a few or a small number of key characters. So it's important to have a strong central or main protagonist in your story, and then everyone else is kind of there to support them. Having too many characters gets confusing. It typically means that you are trying to develop too many people at once, or it can get quite confusing to try and keep track of lots of people. So the smaller the cast of characters, typically the better. The next one is related, and it's about this idea of keeping the strings neat. So there really should be one clear overarching storyline throughout. You probably don't have the luxury or time to be doing multiple different storylines and different characters having different character arcs and having their own sort of individual POVs and all of those sorts of things. Again, that's a bit of a luxury that just comes with a longer kind of story. So keep the strings as neat as possible. Really important to start with a bang. It's probably been drilled into a million trillion times, but it's no less true for doing so. Make sure that you are starting in the middle of an exciting, interesting moment that piques the audience's curiosity and gets them wanting to know more. You really want to also introduce your conflict or the problem that you're going to be exploring in the story as soon as physically possible. The sooner that you do that, the more tension that you can build over a short period of time, and the more impactful that your climax and your resolution is going to be. Speaking of impact, consider what you want it to be. Consider your purpose. What sort of emotions do you want your audience to be feeling at the end? So something that you might be doing that can be quite helpful with this is reading a little bit of poetry. It might seem a bit strange, particularly if you're planning on writing a sort of short story rather than any poetry. But poetry is really all about emotions. It's about getting whoever is reading the poem to be feeling a particular thing. So if you want to explore how poets manipulate emotion and manipulate the experiences and ideas of their audience the most, then you should consider those sorts of things. Have a read of those, play around with those sorts of ideas and those sorts of aesthetic features and choices, purposeful choices, of course, in your own story writing. And then finally, use your motifs. There are few things in life that an English or literature teacher loves more than a repeated symbol or a motif throughout a story. So if you have a broad theme that you're going to be exploring, consider what symbol you might connect to that theme and then how that symbol might reoccur and show up in different forms or situations throughout your story. It's such a sort of simple and achievable way about doing aesthetic features well. And because you can vary the language around the symbol each time, it doesn't actually feel too repetitive or cliche. So definitely be considering what motif you might like to include in this piece. All right, so how do you go about choosing genre? How do you go about choosing a base text and the concepts that you're going to be exploring? So when it comes to choosing a base text, what you want to be, what you work to be inspired by, I would experiment by looking at a range of different styles and a range of different authors about what they offer and about what you like and what calls to you. Stay away from really lengthy novels. Sometimes you can get tied up in the beauty and the glory of them, and you realize when you can't actually use that particular text for inspiration, then it gets a little bit tricky. So because you need to remain in that magical 2,000 word limit, try and focus on shorter stories to learn how authors jam in a whole bunch of tension into a story to pack a punch and fill a piece with meaning. So, as I mentioned earlier, Stone Mattress by Margaret Atwood, this anthology of short stories is really, really excellent because they are all creepy and tense and sort of quite crazy in one way or another. In fact, they're described here as 9 wicked tales. If I just pull up the contents. My favorite is The Dead Hand Loves You. So you can probably look up The Dead Hand Loves You online, and that will, yes, show you'll be able to read it online. That is an excellent expose into how to build tension in a short story, how to pack in meaning and understanding over a short period of time. So I definitely encourage you to have a read of some short stories to understand how authors do them well. It can be really, really helpful when you go about writing it. When you pick a particular genre, it's important to stick to it. You don't have time in 2,000 words to invent an entirely new literary structure. I'm sure that some of you would like to try and do that in your year 12 year, the overachievers in you, but you don't have time. It's really important to remember that there kind of is nothing new under the sun. It's pretty hard to come up with something entirely unique and original, and that's okay. You don't have to try and reinvent the wheel. It's okay to just get stuck in and explore a genre that you know well, and play around with what that looks like at the sort of small detail level rather than trying to reinvent the big broad structure itself. Choose a concept you care about. And the slide is very correct in that I'll stop talking about it when it stops working. You really can tell the difference between a student who's writing about something that genuinely interests them and a student that's writing about something that they don't care about. I've been a tutor for many years. I actually have read so many short stories in my time, and the difference is stark. It really is. So write about something that interests you, write about something that you yourself would want to read about. All right, writer's block, and I shake my fist at the sky at it because it is something that we all experience in varying capacities all the time. So how do we combat the evil force of writer's block? Reading, watching, and listening is one of the biggest ways to get ourselves past writer's block. It's just getting stuck into other works to spark inspiration and give us the ability and skills to get out of it. So it gets you excited about other writing rather than leaving you to slave over an empty page. The other thing that you can do is get stuck into some brainstorming, and particularly brainstorming in a larger group can be really, really excellent. Getting all of your ideas down onto a page, not worrying what those ideas look like or whether or not they'll work. It's just getting them down onto the page to begin with. I really recommend writing them down by hand, but if you're a digital person who prefers to have things on a screen in front of them, then there are plenty of free mind map websites online that you can use, which make your life really, really easy if you want to start drawing ideas together and forming connections between different themes and aesthetic features and the like. The other thing that you can do, and there really is no shame in doing this, is taking a break, stepping away from the work for a little while and coming back to it later. If you can't come up with something right there, right then, that's okay. Distance can really and truly provide clarity. So don't be afraid to step away from the books once in a while. Have a go at something else, another task, a completely opposite task often can be quite helpful. Go and do some maths, study for a while, and then you can come back to literature when you're feeling like your brain is a little bit fresh. Just because you're doing creatives doesn't mean that we're throwing logic out the window. As a reader, it's really important that you have an idea of what's going on at basically every point. It's also important that the reader knows what they're supposed to get out of it and that they have a general grasp on the point, character, or setting. If they don't, if the reader is really confused, then your message isn't clear enough. I really recommend when you are writing to write your purpose, your message up at the top of your Word document or the top of your note page or whatever you're writing on, so you can go back and be referring to it as you write. You're like, okay, am I actually doing this message, or have I waffled and gone off track a little bit? I'm actually doing this message, or is it something else entirely? Make sure you remove that before you hand it in. The other thing that I will say about your message as well is that an easy way to figure out whether or not it's clear is to give your work to a friend and, without telling them what the message is, have them read it and see if they can sort of guess what that message is. If they can't tell, then it's a pretty good indicator that you need to go ahead, get stuck back into it again and see how you can reinterpret that message again so it's nice and clear. While your final piece is going to be built and finalized by you, of course, it's quite a good idea to run your idea past multiple people rather. It's important to make sure that your idea translates to the broader audience and that it makes sense outside of your brain. Sometimes things can seem really great. I have had many a story idea that I thought was excellent, and then I brought it to my teacher, and my teacher said, "Yeah, Maddie, I don't know what you're talking about." And it's a humbling process always, but it's also a very important one because it means that we then get to put our best work forward. So feedback is gold. It's priceless, really and truly. So make sure that you are utilizing it as much as possible. All the information that the audience should need to understand the story needs to be contained within the story themselves. There needs to be no prerequisite or recommended or required reading for them. If you need to explain things further, your clarity is probably lacking a little bit. They are unlikely to earn marks. You are unlikely to earn marks rather, via obscure concepts or vague aesthetic features. So it's okay to be a little bit direct. There needs to be concepts, characters, settings, and themes that people relate to and understand in your story. All right, so the magical words: show, don't tell. So what does this actually mean? Well, my key piece of advice when people say show, don't tell is to unpack it a little bit further and to say make the internal external and the external internet. I don't mean that. I actually mean internal. So take, for example, the idea that she was very excited. What would this look like externally, on the outside of her body? What does excited look like or sound like to someone who's looking on at her? So yes, excitement might feel like butterflies in our stomach. It might feel like sort of shallow breathing. It might feel like warmth, blush on the face. Those kinds of things might be excitement, but what does that look like externally? Is she jittering, bouncing up and down? Is she smiling really, really big? Is she moving and looking around to kind of see if people around her are really excited? What does that actually look like? What about this idea of the room being dirty? So, yes, we can describe that physically, what that might look like, but how does that translate internally? How does that make us feel? How are characters reacting internally to those sorts of ideas? Not every line needs to make the switch from internal to external or external to internal. But if you find yourself lapsing into a basic progression, so plot points, this can be a helpful technique. Yeah. So be considering show don't tell. Now, things like show don't tell, these sorts of more complex, more niche aesthetic features, sometimes this is something that you're not considering too much in your first draft. This is something that comes later. I really can't stress enough how important it is to not take your first draft too seriously and really just use it as an opportunity to be getting those ideas down on the page, developing them slowly, building them a little bit at a time. And then when you get into your second, third draft, then you can start bringing in these sorts of ideas, being really intentional about choosing aesthetic features. If you're trying to do everything at a really, really high level or standard in your first draft, that's when things get really overwhelming, and actually that's when writer's block becomes the most common. So we want to try and take it a little bit at a time, and over a longer span you will get a nicer, higher quality piece of work. All right, speaking of people relating to your characters, it is really important that the characters you are writing are full-bodied and believable. Good characters are believable. Believable characters have motives, goals, and values, just like any other real human being. Now, you can't tell a lot about a person without them you can tell a lot about a person without them having to give you their full life story. This is not an episode of Australian Idol. We don't have to hear the whole sob story in order to relate to someone. You can tell what a person's favorite food might be based on how quickly they consume it, or how much they love someone based on how close they sit to them. Humans have physical cues in the way that they speak and act that can tell you a multitude of things about them without you actually ever having to ask them a single question. Now, to state the obvious, not everyone is going to have the same physical or auditory cues for different things. That's what makes people unique, and it's a good idea to be writing those sorts of different cues into it. So the way that someone loves someone might not look the same. So for some, it might very much be physical touch, but for other people, it might be acts of service or words of affirmation and so on. All right, really important when you're editing your creatives is being prepared to kill your darlings. This was a piece of feedback I was given in year 10 literature by my teacher, who said, "Maddie, you have too many pretty sentences and no one knows what's going on." So you might have written a sentence and it's glorious, the best sentence you've ever written. It's perfect in every way, but it doesn't fit your story. It doesn't fit your message. It doesn't contribute anything to the story. It might not suit the genre, the characters, your message, the task. You have to cut it. You have to get rid of it. If you leave it in, the story becomes clunky, it becomes messy. It doesn't fit the message or moral that you're trying to have anymore. So your task is to shape perspectives in this task. That is your role. And you can't be doing that with trying to piece together disjointed, lovely lines that don't have any sort of clear connecting thread between them. So kill your darlings. If it really, really breaks your heart, you can cut those lines from your piece and paste them rather into a Word document to look at or perhaps use in future creative work if that's what you would like to do. Okay, let's take another short little break, just another minute. Have a read of some of the answers in the Q&A below. And we will get stuck into our final section for today. All right. the magical and mystical and haunting and intimidating external assessment one, your external exam at the end of the year. Now, I know for many of you, this is a point of great fear and pressure. That is okay. That's expected. That's the norm, even. I'm not going to tell you to not be stressed about it because that's not very helpful. But what I am going to say is that you actually have all of the tools that you need to do really well in this task already. Since the beginning of your literature studies, you have been building up the skills that you need to use in this exam. What I really want to do today is just outline the last sort of broad couple of ideas that are necessary to know about this, I think, in order to do the very best that you can. So this is what the QCEE has to say about EA1. The examination is an analytical response to a literary text from the prescribed text list in the form of an analytical essay for an audience with a deep understanding of the text. The purpose is to communicate an informed and critical perspective in response to an unseen question or task on the text studied in depth in Unit 4. So it's an analytical essay. Here's the good news. You've done analytical essays before. In fact, you've done many analytical essays before. Some of the key words that they're really looking for is critical perspective, a deep understanding of the text, communication, analytical, all of those sorts of things. But critical perspective and deep understanding are the key ideas here. So again, we're making informed, intentional choices as we are analyzing. All right, in this task, you are the ultimate authority. No more external critic. We throw the external critic away. They have done their work. And just as IA3 encourages you to bring a wholly unique and independent perspective to your writing, so too does the external assessment. And you are there to guide the analysis. So, an IA1 thesis might look a little something like this. Heart of Darkness has been widely contested, with many arguing that the text is marred by racist undertones. However, critics X proffers that Conrad's language choices throughout the novella challenge the veneer-like quality of imperialist civilization. Critic X's notion is wholly correct, as supported by Conrad's exploration of the fallacy of principles through the opposing ideology and execution of imperialism. No more of that. This is an EA thesis. Shakespeare highlights loyalty as a pivotal force in King Lear by condemning the disintegration of familial bonds and social order. In the first thesis, you are using the critic to take a perspective. In the second, you're standing on your own 2 feet. Beyond this essay is just an essay. It's another analytical task and one that you have done many times before. All right, so considering the humble unseen question, this is a point of great tension for many, many students, and I completely understand why. In fact, I remember the stress of the unseen question still to this very day. As I alluded to much earlier in our session today, typically the prompts and questions in an analytical exam are based around 5 key sort of broad concepts. The first being author's intent, so what the author wants the audience to walk away knowing or understanding about the text. An example of this might be Shakespeare posits that power is a corrupting force in The Tempest, and The Tempest is definitely supposed to be capitalized. Do you agree? The second is this idea of themes. How is the disfiguration of the American dream represented in The Great Gatsby? A third concept might be this idea of aesthetic features or stylistic devices. So, to what end do the storm scenes in King Lear reflect the tortured state of Britain? The fourth is around characters. So, how is Kurtz a metonym for imperialism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness? Again, devastating lack of capitalization. And finally, relationships. Analyze the effect of Mr. Rochester's manipulation on the character of Jane in Jane Eyre. So when you are approaching preparation for this task, these are generally the broad sort of categories that your questions are going to fall into. And I'm going to encourage you to be prepping or planning to do practice plans at least, or practice paragraphs for each of these types of questions. The more familiar you are with each of them, the easier your life is going to be. And I'm going to encourage you to practice and prepare for the types of questions that you are less confident and comfortable with. I, for one, And I think many of you would agree that theme-based questions are really easy. Maybe character questions are quite easy because you talk about that so much in class, and it's a fair bit of sort of surface level, or at least a broad analysis or understanding of a text. It's a lot harder to write a full essay on something like an aesthetic feature or maybe even a relationship. So make sure that you are testing yourself and challenging yourself with questions that you might not naturally be drawn towards, because, you know, who knows, you really could be asked anything in that final exam. All right. Now, memorization. It's a bit of a hot topic when it comes to this sort of task. I am going to encourage you to not memorize an essay to bring it into the room. Typically, this will end in a patchwork essay as you try and force that memorized essay to fit within a question that you had no idea what it was going to be. Memorize key evidence, and if you desire, maybe a basic introduction. Your thesis must be written in the room because your thesis has to be a direct answer to the specific prompt that you were given at the start of the exam. Rather than wasting time writing generic theses to memorize, practice a broad skill set, a broad understanding of the text, and then trust yourself when you're actually in the room to be able to write a thesis that makes sense. Yeah? All right, when you're in the exam room, you have about 15 minutes to plan and then 120 minutes to use that plan however you see fit. Once you have a plan, I'm going to encourage you to stick to it unless you think that whatever you have planned in terms of your paragraphs doesn't actually fit your thesis. But once you have a thesis, I really want to encourage you to stick to it because it just becomes so messy to try and pull and change and tweak everything once you've written half of an essay. So even if you're not super comfortable with it, maybe not super confident with it, I recommend sticking to it. I've seen students try to throw out half an essay after they've used about half of their time and they are floundering to get things done by the end. So I encourage you, trust yourself, take the extra time that you need to write a good, solid thesis at the start, and then stick to it. If you run into a roadblock, a bit of writer's block, or you're not quite sure what you're writing throughout the course of writing the essay, that's totally fine. Leave a little bit of space on the page and then continue on writing the next paragraph, the next section, whatever you need to do. It's really important when you do leave a gap like that, and when you fill it, if you run out of room when you're filling in that gap, to make it really clear where the rest of the writing is. So maybe the rest of the writing is on a later page. You do a nice clear asterisk and say section continued on page, 12. And then on page 12, you do that same really clear asterisk and say continuation of section on page 3 or something like that. And then you fill in the rest of it there, yeah? You want to make the marker's life as easy as possible when you're doing something like that. You don't want to have them trying to on a full treasure hunt, trying to find what you're talking about. Have a wrap-up sentence in mind. So typically at the end of an analytical essay like this, you're going to have a wrap-up sentence which is a broad sort of take on the themes or ideas of the task. And definitely practice writing full essays to identify trouble spots. So practice writing full essays in exam conditions to kind of identify what sections of the process you struggle with the most. So maybe you really struggle to think of how you're going to do audience positioning when you're writing a full essay. So then you know that you need to go away and practice that a little bit more. Maybe it's the introduction is a breeze, but the conclusion is really hard for some reason, or topic sentences you struggle with. Knowing those trouble spots just make your life so much easier because you can then target them as you're preparing further. So try and do a full practice essay in exam conditions relatively early, because then it will sort of allow you to tailor your study moving forward based on what you've learned from that. All right, how to plan well. So you have about 15 minutes in the room to plan in particular, but if you need to use more than 15 minutes to come up with a full plan, then I encourage you to do so. So unpack the question in detail, put keywords from the thesis from the question into your thesis and get your perspective down on the page. I've mentioned this many, many times, but your thesis really is the most important element in the whole essay. So take your time to get it right. Then get your points down. So what your topic sentences are going to be for each of your paragraphs. I encourage you to come up with the specific topic sentences you're going to use on that planning paper. Again, it just kickstarts you each paragraph. You move on to a next paragraph. You're not like, oh, what am I writing for this paragraph again? Oh no, I have that topic sentence right there. You start that and it helps kickstart your flow for each new paragraph. Then for each of the under each topic sentence on your planning sheet, you briefly dot point out the what, so what evidence you're going to use, the so what, the analysis, so how, audience positioning, so now, link back to thesis. And I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but it is really important that you use that formula, the what, so how, so now, for every new piece of evidence that you introduce in the paragraph. So if you're doing 2 pieces of evidence in a paragraph, then you use that formula twice. Probably a good idea on your planning sheet to link your paragraphs together using arrows, demonstrating how you're building on your argument throughout your essay. So this is really important and something that's not talked about too much in the younger years at school, but it's really important in senior that you are developing and building your argument as you go. When you're in your planning process, it's also a good idea to write down any memorized information you have to free up brain space. You don't want to try and be like clinging to whatever you've memorized and then writing at the same time. It just kind of, you've lost brain capacity a little bit there. So write down what you needed to have memorized on your planning sheet, and then you can kind of go there at the end. And it is so important, and I cannot stress this enough, leave time at the end of the session to edit your work. Really, really important. Make sure that you edit your work, go through it in detail. Don't be afraid to check all of the little details, the grammar, the spelling, capitalization of proper nouns, which I clearly have struggled with when putting together this PowerPoint. Make sure that your essay has a title. Make sure that you have really carefully and clearly filled in the bubble of the question that you are answering or the bubble of the text that you're going to be exploring. All of those sorts of things. All right. A few little tips on exam prep to kind of finish and wrap up this session for today. It is vital. It is so important, and I cannot stress this enough, to look after yourself in the midst of exams. You need to prioritize good sleep, as much of a balanced diet as you can, as much hydration as you can, and as much time spent away from the books as possible. So you need to try and remain balanced. And I mentioned this at the start of the session when we were talking about the fact that we're midway through the year. Feeling the pressure to be speeding up, to be loading on the work as we get to the end of the year, that is real. But it is really important to be remembering that your brain needs balance in order to continue to be performing well. So figure out a bit in a schedule how you can be prioritizing these different things, making sure you're going to bed at a consistent time each night, and having at least a decent chunk of time between when you finish study and when you go to bed to let your brain sort of decompress a little bit. Thinking about how you might have a balanced diet and what that might look like to ensure that you have all the nutrients that you need. Your brain requires all those nutrients to be firing on all cylinders and to be doing well. So make sure that you are focusing on that also. Also really important to be hydrating. So something that changed the game for me was to get a water bottle that I liked, that I thought was good. Mine's obviously covered in stickers, but also having one that is a straw-based water bottle can be really good because it's super easy to sip on. It's not very fiddly at all. This one was very cheap, so you can get like a good, decent water bottle for pretty cheap, and it really does change the game. So again, hydration is really important. And of course, making sure that you're scheduling time where you are not studying and scheduling in activities that give you energy. So, this might be spending time with friends, this might be having a nap, this might be having exercising, going on a run or going on a swim, maybe reading something that you love or watching something that you love, making sure that that is regularly scheduled in. All right, important to move away from broad revision into active revision, and this is a tip that I have for all of your subjects. So a lot of students are like, I need to like just go through my notes again, and I go through my notes again, go through my notes again. It is important that you are actually engaging your brain actively. So make sure that you are using your flashcards, doing your practice papers, going through worksheets and problems and examples and all of those sorts of things, writing practice paragraphs. In the case of literature, this is putting your ideas and knowledge into exam-based practice. So getting a practice question and practicing planning for that question in a 15-minute time span, or practicing writing that in exam conditions. It's great and good to be going through your notes. Like there's lots to be gained from that, but it is far more useful to be actively engaging with the content, because that's what you have to do in an exam context. So we practice like we play. It's important to mix up your study techniques and do something a little bit different. There are plenty of things you can be doing to do this. I encourage you to perhaps try studying in a broader group. So study with friends and explain things to each other and gamify things and make it nice and fun. Switch up where you're studying. So maybe going to study in public, like on a uni campus or at a library, or in a cafe or something like that can be really nice. It can be quite productive to have lots of people around you that are working also. So being in that space can be really nice. It also just gives it a shot of novelty. So it's not the same as kind of just like sitting in your room, maybe at your desk, something like that. That can be really good. I also encourage you to mix up how the form of your studying. So maybe if you've been like looking at a lot of notes, maybe you can watch some YouTube videos or a documentary or listen to a podcast or something like that. Maybe doing some flashcards, gamifying things, mixing up the way that you're consuming your content, consuming the study can be really good as well. Draw on the knowledge of your friends. You guys are all in the same boat. In Queensland, it's not a competition in terms of doing well. I encourage you to push each other, to learn from each other, to help each other, and also learn from the knowledge of your past self as well. So your past self has done all of these tasks before. They know those tasks well. Don't be afraid to learn from your mistakes. So go back, explore the feedback that was given to you by your teachers. This might look like actually going to your teachers in person, asking them if they have a free morning tea or lunchtime to go through something in detail and help you figure out a plan on how you're going to grow and develop in that particular area. If you're not super comfortable or confident going to your teacher about that, then there is almost always other teachers in that faculty that will be able to help you with that sort of thing. And of course, any sort of tutors that you work with as well would definitely be willing and happy to help you with that as well. So don't be afraid to reach out to some people who might be able to make sense of that criticism for you and that feedback for you, so that you can improve in the future and kind of be getting the results that you really want. All right. Thank you so much is the last thing that I want to say today. Thank you so much for being here with us and taking this journey through literature units 3 and 4. I hope that you got to learn something new, something that you hadn't considered before. Even just one tip or trick that's going to make your life easier as you study heading into the second half of the year is a victory on my account. Remember that you're going to be able to come back and watch this video again later, so make sure you save the URL to this site. If you are interested in using the resources like the slides, they are available to download in the resources section of this page down below. The live Q&A session is going to be open for another 5 minutes or so, so make sure that you make the absolute most of it while you still have the time. We would love to hear your own insights, thoughts, and feedback as well. So if other students are asking questions and you know the answer, feel free to answer it yourself. It's so cool to have a community based around learning that can help each other out. If you are new to ATAR Notes, we wanted to say thank you so much for registering to be a part of this lecture series. Make sure all of you are going to atarnotes.com to check out all of the incredible resources that we have available there, including some really beautiful new notes that have been uploaded by past and current students of senior subjects that you can go and download for yourself and benefit from. So make sure you go and check that out. And if you're interested in digging in a little bit deeper, check out the possibility of ATAR Notes Plus and the thousands of high quality study resources that are there for you to use and enjoy. You can also follow us on socials, particularly ATAR Notes AUS, which is our Instagram account. We post new study tips and tricks every week, including, excitingly recently, a whole new selection of study playlists. So you can follow us on Spotify if you search ATAR Notes, all capitals ATARN, lowercase OTES notes, then follow us there and you can benefit from our amazing study playlists that have been crafted for focus and attention. Thank you again so much for being here. It's such fun and such a pleasure always to be guiding you guys through this these units rather. I wish you all the very best of luck for the second half of the year. Stay safe, look after yourselves, push yourselves, get stuck into your studies, but also remember to take time away from the books to study and relax. Remember that the only thing that is required for you is to do the very best that you possibly can, and that is the greatest victory of all. I wish you all the very best. I hope to see you soon over at atarnotes.com. But if not, have a lovely rest of your year and all the very best of luck with all of your endeavors.